Good morning, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives, and it's Tuesday morning, and I'm so glad to have Harley Schlanger here, for whom it is not Tuesday morning, but in fact Tuesday afternoon over in Germany. Well, hello, Harley. How are you doing today?
Hi, John. Well, we're a little waterlogged the last couple of days, but otherwise okay.
Oh, you haven't had another one of those floods, have you?
Well, the flooding before was in the southwestern part of the country, but we
Mm.
need the rain, so it's okay.
Yeah, well, we've been blessed with a beautiful spring. All the flowers are just going like crazy, and you should see the size of this chrysanthemum I've got out in front of my yard. It's like it looks like some kind of a mountain or
Wow.
something. Anyway, we're enjoying our fall so far. I actually got a music gig coming up next weekend, and I'm excited about that. I haven't, it's hard to get music gigs when COVID is all over.
When everything's shut down, yeah.
Yeah, but so I'm looking forward to that too.
What are
Good.
you doing?
Oh, I have a number of musical performance things I do. This one will be um, 18th century Scottish music celebration for
Ah,
we have a local historic house here called Maxwell House, and they have an annual fall event. So I and a couple of my compatriots will be providing the music. It'll be
oh,
fun.
great.
Play some Scotland the Brave and
You
Flowers.
know, Scottish folk songs were beloved by Beethoven, and he set some of them to the theme and variations.
Yes, and that's been one of the themes of my life. Really, has been trying to. Oops, sorry. One of the themes of my life really has been my study both of classical and traditional music at the same time, and seeing how they've been integrated by great people like Beethoven and in our more contemporaneous by Aaron Copland with American tunes.
And Dvorak.
Oh, of course, yes.
Yeah.
So it's been a great journey for me to try to pick out the traditional tunes that you hear in Beethoven, and also then the opposite idea of taking my folk music friends and adding some classical
Hmm.
themes and things into the dance music. So it's been a lot of fun. Anyway, and I hope we get back to dancing.
But I actually, it's important because some of what Beethoven did with themes and variations are useful for intelligence work.
Oh,
Because
really?
what he showed is, for example, the Diabelli variations for the piano. He took a theme that was familiar to many people, and by the third variation, it's almost impossible to find it.
Hmm.
And it takes you through, I think, 32, and then you finally realize where he's coming back to.
Hmm. Uh-oh. Back on 33, huh?
Yeah. But it's good for intelligence work, good
Well,
training.
it's good training. Yeah, I imagine. I've often thought that the musical notes could be encoded as letters. But why? If you just heard a tune and then you know that was a word, right? If it was just like ACE, well, that's ace. Okay, I got it. All
Well,
right.
Bach did that with his name.
Yeah, the crab fugue.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. All right. Well, let's spend the rest of the day talking about classical music, Harley. Let's give everybody.
Sometimes it's more fun than having to look at the horrors that are being visited upon us.
Yes. And you forwarded me to your a draft of your most recent article coming out, and it's all about how Pompeo has came up with a hit scheme to get rid of Assange, and I think about Pompeo and that name, meaning powerful, and then right after that
Or
comes
pompous.
or pompous, yes, but
Yeah.
powerful, really, in the Latin, and also podesta,
Hmm.
podesta in Italian, with that
Powerful.
accent on the end, which means powerful, and
Yeah.
that was actually an office that was created by Mussolini for local control, would be
Hmm.
called the podesta. So,
Yeah.
these Italian and Latin references, they resonate with me because this goes way back. I'm hearing Knights of Malta references and all this stuff, you know.
Hmm.
Anyway, let's get into your thoughts on what Mike Pompeo was really up to and who he really is. Who does he really represent?
Well, there are a couple of interesting things I point to. I mean, first of all, the easy thing to do is point out what a liar he is, because he said, for example, supposedly he was asked about, would you be planning assassinations? And he says, well, of course, it's against the law for us to assassinate anyone. And the journalist Caitlin Johnstone pointed out that Pompeo was dancing up and down and doing cartwheels when Soleimani was assassinated. So where was he on that one? Secondly, he portrays himself as a close ally of Donald Trump, when in fact I would argue that as CIA director and then Secretary of State, he was undermining a lot of what Trump was trying to do, including getting out of these wars. That I think Pompeo was the inside guy working with the people on the outside, including some of the military, to keep us in the wars that Donald Trump wanted to get out of. Now, one of the things that comes up is that Pompeo keeps talking about, we were discussing this, we were planning this. And one of the authors of the piece is this guy, Michael Isikoff, who is not a reputable journalist. We're
Oh,
talking about a piece that was in Yahoo News.
boom.
It said that Pompeo was looking into assassinating and or kidnapping Julian Assange, and that he was obsessed, especially after Assange and WikiLeaks exposed the Vault 7 cyber capability, which enabled the CIA to plant messages in other languages, in Cyrillic, or to make it appear as though it was someone else, which of course is very relevant for the whole question of Russiagate. Now, Isikoff was the person who first published the Steele dossier. So he has no credibility. However, in this article, there does seem to be a great deal of credibility in terms of what Pompeo was trying to do. And Pompeo never really denied it. He's had 3 interviews and he didn't say, well, we weren't going to do it. What he said is, well, Assange did a lot of damage to the United States. But he implied that he was discussing this with Trump. Now, Donald Trump said he wasn't about to do it. And in fact, Trump said he thinks Assange is being treated rather poorly by us. And when Pompeo was asked about that, he said, well, I guess we disagree on that because I think Assange treated the American people poorly. Now, what's the real issue here? Why would the CIA be after Assange? Well, that's simple. Assange exposed the role of the CIA in torture, in the dirty war in Syria, in Afghanistan, and Iraq. They got the documents, government documents, and Assange didn't do the hacking, he just published them. And Pompeo, when he was asked about, well, why would these 30 people who were sources for this article speak? Pompeo said, well, I think all of them should be prosecuted. Now, that's what they're trying to do with Assange. Use Assange as a lesson to any journalist who will tell the truth about what's being done by the deep state, that they're going to be subject to imprisonment for life, torture, and or killing. And so the fact that Pompeo is still seriously putting himself forward as an alternative to Trump for president in 2024, that he would present such an argument to his inside team that we have to assassinate him, let's figure out how we can do it and get away with it. And there's one other point to this, because when he was asked about it, he said, well, Isikoff isn't a reliable source, the reporter, because he was part of the Russiagate propaganda hoax. Well, that's true, he was. But what about Pompeo? And in the article, I point out, and I just had a discussion with him again the other day with Bill Binney, the famous NSA whistleblower, who, along with Snowden and people like Thomas Drake, played a big role in exposing the corruption of the National Security Agency and its cyber division. Binney did a forensic investigation of the charge that there had been hacking. And he came up with the conclusion that there was no hacking, it was an inside job. Now, everyone dismissed this at the time when he did it, which was in the middle of 2017. But at the end of 2017, in congressional testimony, actually 2018, Sean Henry of CrowdStrike, who was the main source that it was Russian hacking, admitted there was no evidence of Russian hacking. So you come back to what Binney did. When Binney first put out his study saying there was no Russian hacking, it came to the attention of President Trump. And Trump asked Pompeo to meet with Binney to get Binney's report. Now, why would Trump want that? Well, because he wanted to be exonerated. He didn't want to be accused of having worked with Russian hackers against Hillary Clinton. And so Binney went in and gave Pompeo a 1 hour briefing on what he did. And Pompeo said, well, what do you want me to do? And Binney said, well, this should be exposed. And Pompeo said, well, my people don't agree with this. And Binney said, well, your people are lying to you. And Pompeo said, well, would you be willing to meet with people from the FBI and the NSA to work to show them what you have? And Bill Binney said, absolutely, of course. Now, needless to say, he was never called back, which means that Pompeo, the head of the CIA, had evidence from a top cybersecurity expert that showed I think this was in October 2017, that there was no Russian hack, there was no Russia-Trump collusion. And this would have completely ended the whole Russiagate story if the head of the CIA had come out and said that. But he didn't. So when he protests that Isikoff is part of Russiagate, I would say he's trying to point the finger at someone else other than himself. Pompeo, by not exposing what Binney had done, and Binney didn't work alone. He worked with a group called the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, the VIPs, who did a lot to expose the dirty warfare operations run under George W. Bush, Obama, and Brennan and others. So here's a chance for Binney, or rather for Pompeo, to expose the corruption. And he didn't do it. In fact, he continued it and threatened to kill the messenger as opposed to prosecuting the war criminals. So that's what I cover in my article. And if people are interested, I'll be happy to send it out to you. It'll be published in this week's Executive Intelligence Review. It will be up on my blog page at the LaRouche Organization. And if you want to get a copy from me, just send me an email at harleysch@gmail.com. harleysch@gmail.com, and I'll send you the article.
Great. Thanks very much for summarizing it for us. And I am, one of the things that has been kind of my transition or my journey during the Trump administration. I had a profound change from being an Obama person and then being a Bernie person into supporting Trump, not because I love Trump, but because I was scared to death of the alternative. And I see in Trump and hear in your words a certain dedication to American ideals that surfaces even if a person has been promoted into these positions by, quote, the system or a system. That, for instance, John Kennedy himself was pushed forward, but he had his moments where he had to differ from the agenda of those who had probably put him in that position. The same thing happens to Ronald Reagan, I believe.
Yeah.
And now it's quite believable to say, well, the same thing has happened to Trump now.
It's interesting because there's a whole section of what used to be called the progressive left that were pro-Democrat, believed in Obama, at least initially, and then came to be suspicious of Obama. People like, Glenn Greenwald's an example, or Max Blumenthal or Jimmy Dore. These are people who are supporting Bernie Sanders, and then they watched Bernie sell out to the very people who destroyed him. Because what was Russiagate? Russiagate was about how Hillary Clinton cheated and carried out illegal actions to stop Bernie Sanders in the 2016 Democratic primary race. And so these were Bernie supporters. And then they watched how Bernie sold out in 2020 to the same people he'd been fighting, the same people who stabbed him in the back, who did it again in Iowa in 2020. And so you have a group of them, some of whom don't like LaRouche because they say, well, LaRouche said Obama has Hitler tendencies with his so-called healthcare policy, Obamacare, and so on. Now they say the same thing as we were saying, only we were saying them in 2010, 2011. What we were doing in 2010 and 11 was going after two aspects of Obama's policy. One was that he did the bailout of the big banks that Bush and Hank Paulson drafted to protect the bankers who nearly brought down the financial system in 2008. Obama bailed them out and sold out the homeowners, 7 million of whom lost their homes. Secondly, his Obamacare was a bill for big pharma and for-profit hospitals and insurance companies. It wasn't about a national health care policy. And when Ezekiel Emanuel, who was one of the drafters of it, said we have to start considering whether it's worth keeping people alive after the age of 70, we said, well, we changed his name to Easy Kill Emanuel and said this is what the T4 project was of Hitler. The idea that there are useless eaters and the state can't afford to keep them alive. So we had posters that had a Hitler mustache on Obama, and the left went crazy. Now, most of that left is fully embracing these policies, but the honest ones, people like Blumenthal and Jimmy Dore and Glenn Greenwald, have turned against that. And even though they don't necessarily agree with Trump on all policies, they defended him on Russiagate because they saw Russiagate as an attempt by the establishment, the intelligence community, Wall Street, the City of London, to destroy the Trump presidency because he was a threat to that system. Now, the good news, and I say this advisedly, the good news is that system's collapsing. They're not going to be able to keep it together. The infrastructure bill, the budget bill, the Green New Deal, none of that's going to keep it together. The problem is if you don't have an alternative, we could go into a form of chaos. And they're preparing the grounds with this left-right polarization, the super spy state they're about to set up, and so on. So those of us who are committed to the Constitution and realize the Constitution is not left or right, the Constitution is a set of principles about how government is supposed to represent the interests of the whole nation. And our representatives are chosen democratically, but they function in Republican institutions to make laws to defend the general welfare and the public defense of everyone. So we've got to get back to that system, not the question of left or right, free trade, free market versus socialism. These are the kind of slogans and profiling that they're doing to keep people from figuring out that we're all being hit by the same establishment. The establishment doesn't care whether you consider yourself a liberal or or a conservative, a Democrat or a Republican. They'll steal from you no matter what and suppress you if you try to fight it. So in 2010, just to go back to that point, I was going to some of these rallies in different parts of the country where on one side you'd have the Tea Party protesting against the bailout, and on the other side you'd have the leftists protesting against the bailout, the what was it called, the Wall Street thing, anyway,
something Wall Street,
yeah,
Occupy
Wall Street. So you had the Occupy and the Tea Party who would be screaming at each other, communist, fascist, and then you'd go up and say, wait a second, what do you guys think about Obamacare? They both said it's terrible. What do you think about the bailouts? It's terrible. What do you think about the Federal Reserve? It's terrible. So why don't we work together? And in a sense, that was the basis for what was put together for Donald Trump's campaign in 2016. The problem was that there wasn't a fully articulated program that Trump could bring to the Congress. And secondly, he wasn't supported by the Republicans any more than he was by the Democrats because they were both controlled by the money interests. So we had a test run in 2016 and it didn't succeed. but it showed the potential for a majority of the population to reject the policies that have been these one party policies of whether it's George W. Bush or Barack Obama. So I think we still have an opportunity to pull together that kind of coalition.
Well, there was an image circulating yesterday on Twitter of a group. Then on the left it had Antifa, and on the right it had Trump supporters, and they were all marching against the mandate for the vaccination. The anti-mandate crowd draws people together now from both sides. So there's some of that going on, and I'm very much in favor of everybody just put down the flags and the slogans and look at reality, for goodness sakes. We've got a complicated enough situation without throwing in a bunch of slogans and false loyalties. And there's my question about Pompeo. To whom is he loyal?
Well, I think he made it clear when he first became CIA director. His first speech before the CIA was a blistering attack on Julian Assange. And he basically defended the dirty wars. He defended the Iraq War, the rendition, without naming them, he defended them from the exposure that was given to them by Assange's publications and WikiLeaks. Then at the same time, he gave this other talk where he made it as a joke. He said, well, at West Point, what are the cadets told? You don't lie, cheat, or steal. What do we do at the CIA? We lie, cheat, and steal. And then he laughed. And he said, that just shows how wonderful our system is. Well, I think that was his moment of candor and truth.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, he's loyal to the thieves of Wall Street, the swindlers, who use globalization, who use free market policy to justify what we've seen as a kind of American imperialism when it comes to the rest of the world, and an austerity policy directed against the American people. And as long as the money flows to the upper 1%, Pompeo's happy. He had a long-time connection with the Koch brothers, with many of the military defense contractors. When he was a congressman from Kansas, that's who funded his campaigns. And he maintained that, and in fact, expanded it while he was CIA director and Secretary of State. So I think that's where his loyalty lies. He'll play up to the Trump base, but he's subtly trying to shift it out from under Trump because, look, face it, one other example of his hypocrisy. Who negotiated the deal with the Taliban? If we should never have made a deal with the Taliban, who negotiated it? It was Pompeo. He was the one overseeing the Doha negotiations. Now, he did it because Donald Trump legitimately wanted us out of Afghanistan, which was the right thing to do. Now, after this deal was made, Trump was unable to do it because the military wouldn't go along with it. He was opposed by people like General Milley, opposed by others among the Joint Chiefs, opposed by the Pentagon, and so including Pompeo. So we did not get out of Afghanistan during Trump's time. But when Biden first came in and said he was going to follow up what Trump did, the deal with the Taliban, and get out of Afghanistan, Trump attacked him for not doing it quickly enough. Biden originally said, you remember this, we'll be out by September 11th. And Trump said, well, the deal is we should be out by May 1st. And he was critical of Biden for not doing it then. He didn't say anything about conditions or anything else. He said, we've got to end the war. Now, once Biden moved to do it, and I think it's certainly arguable that Biden made a big mistake by closing down Bagram first and not removing the Americans and others before you took the military out. But that became a cause after the events of August 15th and the next month. So here's Pompeo basically denying his parentage of the agreement and jumping in and criticizing Biden for opportunistic partisan reasons. So, meanwhile, what's going on in the Congress? You have these hearings on Afghanistan, and we find out that the military was opposed to pulling out. And it didn't matter whether it was Trump or Biden, the military wanted to stay in the war. And that's what Pompeo's defending, staying in the war. So I would answer your question. This is a long way of getting back to it, but I think he's owned by the military industrial complex, lock, stock, and barrel.
I Lots of questions pop into my mind. I'll throw two of them at you at once, if I may. The first one is,
Okay.
where is there any daylight between him and Hillary Clinton? It sounds like they're the same. And the second question is, well, I forgot. So let's do the first one.
Well, they may disagree on certain issues, gender issues, and things where Hillary's completely insane. But I think in terms of military, in terms of strategic policy, I don't see any difference. I don't see any difference between him and Obama and Blinken. And, I think the difference is between him and Trump. And here's one other place where we saw it. When John Bolton was moving to sabotage Trump's efforts with Kim Jong-un and North Korea by warning Kim that if you don't go with our timeline, just remember what happened to Gaddafi. Pompeo was pushing the same line. And Pompeo was very prominent in saying we have to threaten Kim with the Gaddafi treatment. So I think in that sense, he was siding with the Hillary Clinton types who were saying Trump is being played by Kim Jong-un. Now, in retrospect, looking back on it, Kim Jong-un wasn't playing Trump. They were actually in a negotiation. There was a deliberation underway. We had a chance to resolve the question of North Korea's nuclear capabilities. And it was sabotaged from the inside by Bolton and Pompeo, because I've been told that Pompeo is arguing against lifting any sanctions on North Korea. Trump was actually saying maybe we should lift a few sanctions to incentivize him to move ahead. And Pompeo stood with Bolton saying, no, that's a sign of softness, of weakness. That was the same line Hillary had, same line that sabotaged the talks with North Korea going back to Bill Clinton. Bush had some openings, George W. Bush had some openings, and that was sabotaged. Obama never even tried. And Trump made a legitimate effort. He walked into North Korea. And I think that was much to the disgust of people like Bolton, Pompeo, and their neocon buddies, and Hillary Clinton. So I don't think there's that much difference in terms of the strategic approach between Hillary and Pompeo.
So that to me, I mean, it sounds trite, but it's huge, really. If the American people were to realize that it's not Democrats or Republicans or the differences that we hear on TV that drives American policy at all. It is the broad unity behind the military-industrial complex that is behind both parties. And as Andrew Craig's great book "Presidential Puppetry" shows, everybody since Bush the first has been a puppet of these CIA people. And
let's take it a step further, because it's not just strategic military policy. Remember what happened in 2007, 2008. I don't know if you know this, maybe you've seen some of the articles since you've gotten to know us, but in 2007, in July, LaRouche forecast a banking crisis that was going to be a big one. And he said it was related to the run-up of property values, the derivative contracts that were being settled or being negotiated based on mortgage-backed securities and so on. I was there at a webcast he did in Washington, D.C., I think it was July 25th, 2007, where he forecast within a year, he said, we're going to have a crash. Now, it was a little bit more than a year, but the crash was going on in June and July of 2008. Now, as that was happening, there was one voice saying something different. That was LaRouche. LaRouche said, let the investment banks and the universal banks and the speculators eat the losses. let's go back to banking separation on Glass-Steagall, which means that the government will be obligated to defend the commercial banks, that is, the depositors' contracts. If you had a checking account, a savings account, a business account, and a commercial bank, that would be protected. But if that commercial bank was drawing on that money to buy mortgage backed securities and derivative contracts, the investment bank would have to take the loss. That would have worked beautifully. The idea of bankruptcy for the bankrupt financial institutions. We had a chance to present that to John McCain's campaign. You may remember Bush and Paulson were on television saying that we have to save the banking system. We need this TARP bill. We need the big bailout. And there was a question, what would Obama and McCain do? Because this was playing out during the presidential campaign. I met with a very top person in the McCain camp and laid out LaRouche's policy to him. And I said, look, McCain could be a real hero. Because McCain was saying he's not sure about the bailout. Because he got burned, remember, on Lincoln Savings with Keating from years before, the S&L crisis, where he was one of the people named in a suit because of the losses that were made by his friend, Charles Keating. So McCain was hesitant, and I met with one of his top people, and I laid out the strategy, and I said, get back to me as soon as you can, and if you need some help with this, we'll meet with you, we'll help work it through with you. 2 days later, McCain and Obama met with Bush, Hank Paulson, several others, I think Bernanke, and came out of the meeting and said, we all agree that a bailout is necessary for the financial system. And McCain, my contact in the McCain camp, called me and said, we discussed it. He didn't tell me if he discussed it with McCain, but he said, we think it's probably the right thing to do, but there's no way we could get it through. Now, that was a moment, a defining moment in the two parties coming together for a bailout. The two parties coming together to agree that the Federal Reserve will continue to pump money into bankrupt financial institutions to protect them. What Obama's Attorney General Eric Holder called systemically important institutions. He said, we cannot penalize them, even if they did things wrong. That became US government policy on both parties. And so that means from 2008 to the present, we've had flows of funds going into speculation. That's why the stock market has gone from, what was it, 15,000, 13,000 up to 35,000, the Dow Jones. That's supposedly the great economic recovery. Well, if you're one of the leading holders of these bonds and derivatives and in debt because of it, you're happy because you're getting cheap credit, which means the biggest, most bankrupt financial institutions are getting bailed out while businesses are allowed to collapse. Homeowners are still losing homes or will lose them in much greater numbers when this protection from the COVID plan ends. So this is the swindle of both parties. So both parties support permanent war. Both parties support permanent bailouts. And the Republicans, except for Trump, most of the Republicans are soft on fighting against the green policy. So they may talk against it, but they're not doing anything about it. So that's where we have a one-party duopoly, as Roger Stone calls it.
Well, Roger Stone is right about that, as far as I can see. Your example there just really is powerful and nails it. Clearly, when given the chance to work together to preserve the value of our savings as a nation, as opposed to protecting the elite interests of the banks and those who own and control the banks won. And that's been the story ever since. The banks keep winning.
And you know what it goes back to, John? Because this is another important point. When Bush first came in, there was a fairly severe energy crisis in California. And this had to do with the Enron deregulation bill.
Okay.
And so you had the price of electricity skyrocketing because of the deregulation bill passed by both parties almost unanimously in 1996 in the California legislature, deregulating electricity, meaning you couldn't be a producer of electricity and a distributor. They broke the Utility Holding Company Act and created something where anyone could become a distributor if they could get some credit, get a corporate license, and start underselling everyone else. So what happened? How do you undersell someone on electricity? You don't do maintenance. You don't do upgrades. And this is why California is still having blackouts to this day. Now, when push came to shove, and I also had an interesting moment here because I was in California at the time, and I met with people on Gray Davis's staff, the then governor of California, and they said, well, what would LaRouche do? And I said, LaRouche would have the state take over these small companies and make sure electricity was delivered at the original price, not the jacked up price. And one of his top aides said, well, if you do that, Bush and Cheney will send the National Guard. And I said, yeah, but the National Guard is under the governor's command. And so it was an interesting moment once again where there could have been something done. And what was done instead? Well, Bush and Cheney intervened to defend Enron. Enron went bankrupt in December 2001. But this process of bankruptcy was part of what LaRouche was warning about in January 2001, when he warned that there would be an economic crisis and the Bush administration would need a Reichstag fire event to enact emergency government. That was his forecast, which came true with the September 11th event later that year. So all of these things fit together. The piracy when it comes to power production, the deployment of the deep state for strategic concerns, and so on. And just one other brief autobiographical note, because I'm actually very proud of this. I was invited to testify before the Mexican Senate in Mexico City, where they were being pushed to go with the Enron model for Mexico, to nationalize or to denationalize, break up Pemex, and run it the way they were running Enron in the United States. I testified against that in the Mexican Senate. The newspaper the next day, the leading paper in Mexico City, had an article, Fox versus Harley, Vicente Fox, the president of Mexico. We beat it in Mexico, but we lost the fight in the United States. And that's the power of this one-party financial system that we're still facing today.
Wow. That's an exciting thing to have participated in. And Vicente Fox went with Harley Schlanger and the LaRouche plan. But
Well, he went against us. It was the other parties that went with us.
oh, I beg your pardon. Yeah,
Yeah, Fox was fighting us.
I was wondering because he has that look of
Free market.
aristocracy about him. Yeah.
Yeah, he was a big free market man.
Free market and aristocracy go together pretty
Yeah,
well.
exactly.
Is people, that's a point that people don't really realize. It's so confusing. If you look in American history, and the idea of free trade has been a political slogan since the War of 1812 or before, and that the slogan of free trade and sailors' rights was the pitch for Americans to fight against the British in 1812, and it caught on so big. They had flags that said that free trade and sailors' rights. What does that really mean? Did anybody sit back and think, well, okay, what does free trade mean? And say, well, sailors.
You know who did think about that?
We're all for sailors' rights, and that was the part where, like, yeah, individual rights, and that's how those guys won. But the free trade, yeah, I'll let you tell us.
Well, Hamilton and Benjamin Franklin opposed the idea of free trade. They saw that as British monopolistic practice.
Exactly.
And George Washington agreed. And that's why Hamilton set up a national bank. And this is where modern conservatives like the Heritage Foundation, people like Pompeo, and all of them attack Hamilton as a monarchist. And they say Hamilton was the forerunner of the Federal Reserve. It's not true. He did not want a private central bank. The original Bank of the United States had shareholders who were private, but the majority of the power was in the hands of the government. Now, some people will say, well, that takes away our freedom. Well, whose freedom? Who are the people with enough money to become shareholders in a national bank? They're the wealthiest people in the world. That's the oligarchs. And Hamilton was opposed to that. And his policy of a national bank, a government-run national bank for credit, not for monetary distribution, but for credit policy, combined with opposing free trade, combined with internal improvements, that was the American system. That's what built our nation. That's what the best presidents between the time of the Revolution and the 20th century, the best presidents who presided over the greatest growth of the economy, all adopted that Hamiltonian system. But starting with Teddy Roosevelt and continuing with Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat who supported the British policy, we've had this fight in the 20th century where it used to be the Democrats were opposed to free trade and the Republicans wanted free trade. Now they're all free traders. That's the power of the banks, the private banks, and their control over the central banks.
Yes. And free trade sounds like such a great idea. It's just like, oh, I love freedom, freedom
Yeah.
trade. If I got some stuff here, I want to trade with you and I don't want to pay tax on it. Don't tell the government you can have it and I'll do this and we'll be good, but don't tell the government. And that's free trade.
And it's based on a fallacy, John. The
Yeah,
fallacy is that you can get things cheaper if you allow the so-called market to set the price. Well, you might be able to do that for a while, but what ultimately makes things cheaper is improving the technology and the scientific input to your productive process and
mhm.
improving the quality of your workforce. It's labor productivity and technical investment that cheapens the cost. And you have to add to that also upgrading infrastructure. That's what gives you cheaper costs. If you merely do what Adam Smith called for, buy cheap and sell dear, then ultimately you're going to have a rundown system. You're going to have a bubble with a collapse of production, then you're going to have to start over again. So the American system is based on the idea that you can sustain economic growth by constantly injecting credit into the hands of entrepreneurs, scientists, research and development, and in some cases in corporations as well, because not all corporations are run by sleazy criminals. Some of them actually believed in the idea of technological progress as the way you cheapen the costs. But this was a big fight. McKinley had a big fight in 1896 because he said cheap is not cheap. He said cheap is deceptive. And you know who was funding the opposition to him? The City of London, who set up in the United States the University of Chicago Economics Department to run as a free trade institution against McKinley. And McKinley won. McKinley was a product of the Lincoln Republican Party. And what happened to him? He got assassinated. And his vice president turned out to be the Anglophile Teddy Roosevelt. So that's the fight we've had in this country.
Yeah, and we need to tell people about it. That's what you're doing. That's what we're trying to do here with McDuff Channel, and uh, we're uh, unpacking the history while it's still
Mhm.
available. The books that I read, they may not be here forever. Things, the history that has been recorded only on the internet can be changed by the internet. So I'm really into actual owning my books now. I know you're a big person for having books too, and I just can't emphasize how important it is to keep our libraries going, keep our real books going, and not fill the libraries with all the junk that I see when I go in them American libraries are getting full of, just old uh, reruns of TV shows and a bunch of nonsense.
Or books on how to have 47 different sexes.
Yeah, yeah, and don't criticize a single one of them. Um, Look, let's go back to Glass-Steagall for a second, because this is a point I've made a number of times, and I'm trying to get past it. When they let the speculation money, what they let was money laundering into the main financial system, so that when you say that corporations didn't always weren't always run by these elite criminals, well, that's true. But once you let the elite criminals come in and launder their ill-gotten gains through your legitimate business, then you've given up. You've handed the reins over to the criminal enterprise that's behind all of it. And from the the dope business to all the worse horrible things we hear of, such as human trafficking. The, those,
John, you know, we wrote a book on Dope Incorporated,
yes,
which
yeah,
traces this back to the British East India Company and the money laundering operations that were part of the opium wars against China run by the British, where the British took over Hong Kong and set up the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, which became the leading money laundering bank in the world. Now, these bankers were also monopolists. They were setting up corporate cartels. The Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Rothschilds, and others were involved in this through World War One, and the Great Depression was an opportunity to change that. And there was a man named Ferdinand Pecora who was assigned the task of investigating the relationship between the banking system, which at the time was a kind of universal banking system, and the utilities. Why there was no electric power in certain parts of the country, and in other parts it was highly expensive. And Pecora then showed that this was the original Panama Papers. He showed that people like J.P. Morgan paid no taxes. You know, the richest men in America paid no taxes. They were frauds and cheats. Now, Roosevelt used that to push through Glass-Steagall to separate commercial banking from investment banking. But this was an unfinished revolution, because what Roosevelt was faced with was a real danger in the country that you could have had chaos from the large numbers of unemployed. You did have mass strikes, but at the same time, the mass strikes, he directed them to work together to build a modern auto industry, for example, in Detroit. And that was necessary for World War II. But he never had the time, I think. I think he postponed dealing with the Federal Reserve System. Instead, he used things like Reconstruction finance to generate credit that would go to industry. Now, after he died, you still had people who were fighting for that conception of a national bank, but it became less and less and less, and more incorporated the idea that the private central banks have absolute ironclad control over credit. Now, once you do that, you hand to private speculative interests the power over the money supply. And the only thing that was a break against that was the gold reserve system of the Bretton Woods system, which got thrown out by Nixon in 1971. And then for a while, for much of the next 30 years, you had what was called the petrodollar system. But essentially, you no longer had anything backing up most currencies. And because the United States was the strongest country in the world, we could impose our terms on every other country's currency. Now we're at a point where we're not producing enough to back up the power of the dollar. And so there's an attempt to move into this great reset, where they want to give these central banks not only the power over credit generation, over currency production, but also over spending. Take it away from representative government. That's the real threat of the Great Reset. People talk about Davos and Klaus Schwab and all of these other things as dictators. Well, what is it they're trying to dictate? They're trying to take away the power from our elected representatives to make a budget. And when you have the idiocy we're seeing in the Congress right now over the budget fight, where both sides are horribly wrong, it lends credence to the argument that we need technocrats to handle the spending as well as the creation of money. But that's not true. It needs the American people intervening and keeping our representatives honest. What Roosevelt did with the fireside chats was rally the population to support projects such as Glass-Steagall and the TVA and investment in productive industry. That's what we were seeing start to happen with Trump, but it got sidetracked. And part of the way it got sidetracked was this idea that his tax cuts would bring prosperity. He, I think, intended to have a second part of the tax cut, which was to incorporate John F. Kennedy's idea of investment tax credits, that you can get your money back when you bring it back from overseas. You can get it back provided you invest it in something that's physical, that produces something of value. Instead, they were allowed to have the freedom to do whatever they want with that money. And what do? They bought their own stock. They built up the stock bubble so they can increase the bonuses for the executives. So, and how do they get away with it? They say, well, we have to give freedom to the people who create the jobs and the money. No, we don't. We need a regulated system, but regulated for the general welfare. And how do we determine that? That's up to the American people to fight it out with your congressmen, with your senators. And that's why these kinds of discussions are so useful, so that people actually get a sense of how this process works and how necessary the American people are, not just how they're manipulated around their emotions, but can they really think through the solutions to these problems?
Well, that's what we have to do. We have to think, think. And as they used to put it up on the wall, well, that's what we try we try to do. Harley, thanks again for being with us. Wish our hour was not nearly over, but I want to give everybody a chance to rush over to Neighborhood News Hour for their noon show. And thanks again to you and everybody at LaRouche Organization. It's been a lot of fun, as it always is, and I look forward to seeing you again in another 2 weeks.
Okay, John, good being with you again.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone.